The kitchen was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah walked in, tired from a long day of work, and noticed Mark's phone lying on the counter. It wasn't unusual for him to leave it there. He often did, thinking it was safe. She was just about to grab a bottle of water when something stopped her. A gut feeling, sharp and unshakable, whispered that now was the time. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone, feeling the weight of the moment. Unlocking it, she saw the screen filled with messages. At first, it looked like harmless banter, a few words, a couple of emojis. But as she scrolled, her pulse quickened. Explicit photos, flirtatious comments, and phrases that made her stomach twist. The woman's name, Rachel, appeared again and again. Sarah's heart dropped. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker. She couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark, the man she thought she knew, had been sharing intimate moments with someone else. The tears started to well up, but Sarah refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not when she was still trying to grasp the full weight of what she had just discovered. Mark. Sarah's voice was steady, though her hands shook as she handed him the phone. He looked up from his drink, the nonchalant look on his face irritating her more than anything. She'd hoped for an explanation, an apology, even if she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. But his gaze didn't show guilt. It showed irritation. "What's this?" Sarah's voice cracked, but she held it together, her finger pointing to the messages. Mark barely glanced at the screen before taking a slow sip of his drink. "It's nothing," he said, his tone dismissive. "Just some harmless texts. Don't make a big deal out of it, Sarah. You're overreacting." Sarah's stomach churned. Overreacting? He set the glass down and met her eyes. "You always do this, don't you? I'm just trying to live my life, and here you are accusing me of something that isn't even a problem." I saw the pictures," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking despite her best effort to stay calm. Mark shrugged, feigning innocence. "You're being paranoid. Maybe you're just feeling insecure, that's all. Maybe you need to relax." Her hands clenched into fists, but Mark's calm demeanor, so deliberate, so controlled, had a chilling effect. He wasn't worried. He wasn't afraid. He was manipulating the narrative, shifting the blame onto her. And for a moment, doubt crept in. Was she really overreacting? Sarah's thoughts were scattered as she stood frozen in the kitchen, Mark's words echoing in her mind. The phone, now back in her hands, felt heavier than before. Betrayal wasn't just about another woman. It was about everything Mark had promised her, the years they had spent building a life together. What was all of it worth now? Her trust, her love, was shattered in an instant. It felt like the ground beneath her was giving way. She had always believed in their marriage. She had believed in him. But now, it seemed as though the foundation of her life had cracked open, exposing the rot she'd never noticed. The void that followed was suffocating. The life she thought she had was crumbling, and she was left standing in the ruins, unsure of who she even was without it. Her mind raced. Flashes of their past together, of the promises he had made her, now tainted with the knowledge of his infidelity. The anger began to rise, bitter and sharp. How could he? How long had this been going on? As Sarah grappled with the flood of emotions, Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm telling you, this isn't a big deal," he repeated, his calmness infuriating her. "You always find a way to blow things out of proportion. This is your issue, Sarah." Her jaw clenched. "My issue?" "Yeah, your issue." Mark crossed his arms, leaning back against the counter as if the situation were no more serious than a disagreement over dinner. You've been distant lately, haven't you? Maybe if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have to seek it elsewhere. You should be more grateful that I'm here, not questioning every little thing I do." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Mark had turned the tables on her. He wasn't the one at fault. She was the one who had driven him to this. The mind games, twisting the situation to make her feel guilty, had begun. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, though the apology tasted bitter on her tongue. "I should have been more aware of your needs." Mark's lips curled into a smug smile, a look of someone who believed they had already won. "That's better. Maybe now we can move on and forget this ever happened." But Sarah wasn't so sure. His words, though manipulative, couldn't erase the truth of what she had seen. The fact remained. He had betrayed her, and no amount of gaslighting could change. That Sarah stood there, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Her heart ached, but she knew that the pain of staying in this web of lies would be worse than facing the uncomfortable truth. She couldn't let Mark's manipulation control her anymore. "I'm done," she said, her voice firm, even as her insides twisted. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living in the darkness of his lies. Mark's eyes widened. "What do you mean, done? Sarah, you don't mean that." "I do." Her hands trembled, but she didn't back down. "I've seen enough. I won't keep pretending everything is fine." Mark's stunned silence filled the space between them. Sarah turned and walked toward the door. Her body was tense, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. But there was a clarity she had never felt before. This was the end. The door slammed behind her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had taken the first step toward reclaiming herself. And that was enough. For now. At 34, Sarah sat on the couch, staring absently out the window. The house was quiet, the children tucked away in their rooms, and Mark was gone again, his office hours stretching into the night. She thought back to the day she made the decision to leave her job. It had seemed like the right choice at the time. Mark's entrepreneurial dreams were taking flight, and she was proud to stand beside him, supporting his ambitions. But now, after years of sacrificing her own career, she felt trapped. Her world had shrunk to the confines of this home, her identity fading in the background of his success. As the years passed, the sacrifices grew heavier. The small moments she once shared with friends were replaced with silent dinners and unspoken resentments. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. She had put her dreams on hold, but with every passing year the bitterness grew. How long would she be expected to do this? For him? For the kids? The sacrifices felt invisible, as if they no longer mattered, like the life she'd once envisioned slipping through her fingers. It wasn't just the long hours or the trips away. It was the silence between them. What once had been laughter-filled mornings and late-night conversations had dulled into routine, predictable and stale. Mark would return home, exhausted, with his mind still tangled in business matters, his attention split between his phone and his thoughts. Sarah would wait, hoping for a spark, a connection, but it was always just out of reach. Her complaints had started small, almost imperceptible. Why wasn't he home for dinner again? Why hadn't he called when he said he would? But soon, they became sharper, more insistent. She asked, but the answers were always the same. "I'm working late. You know how it is, babe." He seemed to retreat further every time she reached out. His presence in the house became an empty one. Every now and then she'd catch glimpses of a softer Mark, the one she fell in love with. But it felt distant, like a memory fading in the rear view. She would lie awake, her mind racing, asking herself what went wrong, but the answers never came. And in that silence, Sarah found herself slipping deeper into a void, unsure of who they were anymore. As Mark's business flourished, so did his absences. The days turned into nights and the trips turned into weeks. His focus had shifted entirely, leaving Sarah to manage the house and children alone. Whenever she tried to ask for more time, more attention, he would dismiss her concerns, assuring her it was all for their future. "I'm doing this for us, for the kids," he'd say, his tone clipped, like a man who had made his peace with sacrifice but was too blind to see how much of their life was slipping away. But the truth was, she felt like a ghost in her own life, waiting for his return, waiting for an acknowledgement. His words no longer felt like promises but like hollow justifications for his neglect. She began to wonder if his sacrifices had less to do with them and more to do with himself. One evening after dinner, Sarah found herself watching Mark as he made excuses to avoid her gaze. She asked about his trip, about the people he had met, but his answers were vague. He was defensive when she asked if he'd had dinner with a colleague named Rachel during his recent business trip. "I told you I was working," he snapped. "Stop being paranoid." But there was something in his voice that unsettled her, a tinge of anger as if she were accusing him of something he hadn't done. And still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When she asked to see his phone, he refused. "I told you everything. Trust me," he'd said, but his words felt rehearsed. For a long time, she pushed her doubts aside, telling herself it was just the stress of his work. But every time he became defensive or changed the subject, a little voice in her head told her she was ignoring something far more dangerous. The house felt like a mausoleum, and Sarah's role had turned into that of a caretaker, mother, housekeeper, organizer of family schedules. But it had been so long since she felt seen or heard by Mark. His mind, his heart, were elsewhere, and she began to wonder if she still mattered to him at all. Her loneliness was like a heavy blanket, smothering her at every turn. She missed the intimacy they once shared, the late-night talks, the stolen kisses. Now it was as if they were strangers passing each other in the hallway, exchanging pleasantries but never truly touching. She started avoiding mirrors, hating the woman she saw staring back at her, the woman who had given up so much for a marriage that no longer felt like a partnership. Her sense of self had eroded. She wasn't just alone. She felt invisible. It happened one night when Sarah found herself alone in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone as she sipped a glass of wine. Mark's phone, carelessly left on the kitchen counter, beckoned her. She could feel her pulse quicken as she reached for it. The lock screen was open. Without thinking, she opened his text messages. What she found was a message from someone she didn't recognize. Rachel, a name that had come up before in passing conversation. The message was flirtatious, intimate. "Can't wait to see you next week. I miss you." Her stomach twisted. Her fingers shook as she read the words again. Unable to process the betrayal, the world around her seemed to tilt. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a cold, hard fact staring her in the face. The truth was undeniable. Mark had been unfaithful. The cracks in their marriage, once ignored, were now a chasm she could no longer cross. Tears welled up. But before they could fall, anger surged inside her. The betrayal was no longer just an idea. It was real, and it would change everything. Sarah sat in the parked car across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot where Mark's latest business meeting was taking place. She knew she shouldn't be here, knew it was a breach of trust, but the need for answers consumed her. Her heart raced as she watched Mark enter the building with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was tall, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. They exchanged words, laughter even, before disappearing inside. The gnawing sensation in Sarah's chest intensified. Was this the woman from the text messages? Over the following days, Sarah followed Mark again, this time to a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. She watched him sit across from a woman, their conversation more intimate than she'd ever seen him with anyone. She noticed the subtle touch of his hand on hers, the way he leaned in close, whispering in her ear. The confirmation came when Sarah checked Mark's phone one afternoon while he was in the shower. The hidden texts, the sweet words exchanged between him and the woman, each one was a dagger to her heart. She felt sick as she read through the messages. I can't wait to see you tonight. I need you so much. The same words that now felt like a betrayal. Her mind screamed in disbelief, yet the evidence was undeniable. The woman, the meetings, the money. Each discovery pushed her closer to the truth. The shock of what she was uncovering sank deep into her bones, each realization more painful than the last. Days passed, but the pain remained sharp. Sarah couldn't stop herself. She had to know more. Each hidden text she uncovered painted a clearer picture of the betrayal that Mark had been hiding. The messages grew more intimate, the tone more suggestive, like a private world she wasn't a part of. But it wasn't just the words. Sarah found financial transfers between Mark and the woman. Large sums of money sent to a private account, far more than he'd ever spent on their family. There were gifts listed, luxurious ones, things she never received. Sarah's stomach churned. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a fling. Mark wasn't just having an affair. He was financing it, emotionally and financially. As she sat there staring at the phone in her hand, a mixture of anger and humiliation boiled inside her. The realization that Mark was providing for his mistress in ways he never did for her felt like a slap to the face. The disparity between their marriage and the relationship he was nurturing with someone else couldn't have been more clear. How could he do this? How could he lie to her for so long? With every new detail, Sarah felt her pride crumble, and the anger that replaced it was palpable. She was no longer just a wife scorned. She was a woman betrayed in every way possible. When Sarah confronted Mark, she could see it in his eyes. The nervous shift, the way his posture stiffened. He knew she was onto him, and he knew it wasn't good. But instead of coming clean, he launched into damage control. Sarah, what are you talking about? His voice was defensive, tight. This is all in your head. I don't know where you're getting all this from. Sarah held his gaze, her voice cold and steady. Don't lie to me, Mark. I know everything. The text, the money, the woman. Mark's face contorted with a mix of irritation and disbelief. You've been spying on me? You're accusing me of things I haven't done. He shook his head in exasperation. You think I'm the bad guy here? You've been neglecting me for months. You don't even listen to me anymore, Sarah. I'm alone in this marriage. What was I supposed to do? The words hit Sarah like a slap. He was manipulating her, twisting the truth to fit his narrative. Mark wasn't the victim, he was the perpetrator. He was the one who had abandoned her, who had taken their marriage for granted. But he had the audacity to accuse her of pushing him away, of forcing him into the arms of another woman. Don't turn this around on me, Sarah spat, her eyes burning with fury. This is on you. All of it. The confrontation left Sarah feeling numb. As much as she wanted to expose Mark for the man he had become, she couldn't shake the feeling of Doubt that still lingered. Her heart was torn. How could she destroy everything, her family, her children, her home, over something so dark? At night, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, Sarah found herself lost in thought, wrestling with her emotions. Her friends and family urged her to act, to stand up for herself, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to do it. Was she overreacting? Could she truly expose Mark's betrayal, or was it all just a product of her own insecurity? The guilt that plagued her made her second-guess everything. Every time she thought about confronting Mark, the weight of the consequences hit her. Would it be worth it? What would happen to their family? The emotional isolation was suffocating. She had no one to turn to, no one who truly understood the pain she was feeling. She could feel the walls closing in as her mind continued to spiral, caught between the truth she had uncovered and the future she didn't know how to face. The pressure was mounting. Sarah's friends told her she needed to confront Mark, to take control of the situation. "You deserve the truth," they insisted. "You need to stand up for yourself. He's not going to change." Her mother, too, urged her to leave him. "You're better than this. You don't need a man who doesn't respect you." But despite their encouragement, Sarah hesitated. Every piece of advice she received seemed to pull her in a different direction. Some told her to fight for her marriage, others said it was time to walk away. The conflicting voices only made her feel more isolated. She knew she had to make a decision. But how could she be sure? The truth felt like a double-edged sword, and Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to wield it. It all came to a head one night after another heated argument. Mark had stormed out, leaving Sarah standing in the living room, trembling with rage. But something shifted in her that night. Something deep inside her snapped. She was done being the passive participant in this toxic dance. Instead of confronting Mark head-on, she decided to play the game. She began to feign uncertainty, acting as though her suspicions were just wild imaginings. She let him believe she was weak, vulnerable, and willing to forgive him if he showed any remorse. "Maybe I overreacted," she said one evening, as they sat in the living room. "I've been under so much stress lately. I don't know what's real anymore." Mark's eyes softened, and he seemed to believe her. For the first time in a long while, Sarah saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, the hope that she had forgiven him. But deep down, Sarah knew better. She was playing him. She was making him think she was naive, while all the while she was plotting her next move. As days passed, Sarah's resolve grew stronger. The emotional weight of the situation had hardened her. She no longer sought validation from Mark. She didn't need his apology, didn't need his assurances. She had the upper hand now, and it was time to take control. She watched Mark closely, learning his routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. With every passing day, Sarah felt a sense of power returning to her. The woman who had been crushed under the weight of her marriage was no more. She was in control now, and soon she would make Mark pay for what he had done. The calm before the storm was palpable. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, Mark would have no one to blame but himself. The quiet hum of the house was deafening as Sarah stood in the center of the living room, preparing herself. Rachel would arrive soon. She had made the call herself. This wasn't just any meeting, this was the moment Sarah had been planning for weeks. Her heart pounded with anticipation. She had gathered everything, the texts, the bank transfers, the pictures, each one carefully pieced together to expose Mark's betrayal. She knew this would hurt, but it was the only way to take back control. Mark had no idea what was waiting for him. He was out as usual, caught up in some business affair. But when he walked in tonight, everything would change. Sarah's mind was focused, calm, and as much as it terrified her, she felt a strange sense of empowerment. She was no longer the desperate, questioning wife. Tonight, she would be the one with the answers. The sound of the doorbell startled her. It was Rachel. Her stomach clenched, but Sarah kept her composure. She opened the door, letting the other woman in, and the two shared an uneasy glance. "We'll do this quickly," Sarah said, voice steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly. "It's time he faces the truth." The front door creaked open and Mark stepped inside, expecting the usual quiet end to his long day. But what he found instead made his breath catch. The living room was far from the sanctuary he was accustomed to. It felt more like a courtroom. Sarah and Rachel stood side by side, their eyes locked onto him, leaving him no room for escape. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "We need to talk." He froze, confusion overtaking his initial shock. "What's going on? Here?" His eyes darted between the two women, his mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. "Sit down," Sarah said, not giving him a choice. "We're not going anywhere until we have a conversation." Rachel didn't speak, but there was something in her eyes. Guilt? Fear? Whatever it was, it fueled Sarah's resolve. Mark shook his head, trying to play it off. "I don't know what this is about, but—" "No, Mark," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't get to explain this away, not anymore." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of the unspoken truth pressing in on all sides. Mark tried to backpedal, but Sarah was ready. She pulled out her phone, her hand steady now, no longer shaking. "You think I haven't seen everything? Every text you sent her, every dollar you've given her? Given?" She swiped through the messages, showing Mark the evidence one by one. Mark's face drained of color as the intimate conversations came into view. The sweet nothings, the promises of a future beyond their marriage. It was all there. Rachel, his mistress, looked down at the floor, unwilling to meet his gaze. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, Sarah," Mark stammered, his voice rising with panic. He reached for his wife, but she pulled away, her expression unflinching. "You didn't mean for me to find out? Or you didn't mean for me to catch you?" Sarah's voice was icily calm, but there was no mistaking the fury simmering beneath the surface. "Did you even love me, Mark? Or was it just convenient?" Mark's attempts to speak were futile. He couldn't deny the truth she laid out before him. Sarah moved to the next piece of evidence, a bank transfer, one of many. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the money? The expensive gifts? Your girlfriend gets more than I ever did, doesn't she?" The shock on Mark's face was undeniable. His breath was ragged, his eyes darting as if looking for an escape he knew didn't exist. His hands trembled as he tried to maintain control of the conversation. But it was too late. Sarah had taken it all back. Mark's voice wavered. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you." She shook her head, her eyes cold, her heart no longer swayed by his words. "No, Mark. You don't get to apologize anymore. You've already hurt me enough." He took a step toward her, his desperation evident. "Please, let's talk about this. I can make it right. I'll fix everything, I swear." But Sarah wasn't listening. She wasn't the woman he had once manipulated. "I've heard enough." Her words were like a final verdict, a sentence passed without remorse. "I'm done. This marriage is over." Mark's face crumpled, and for the first time Sarah saw him as the broken man he truly was. The man who had lied, betrayed, and gaslighted her into thinking she was the problem. But no longer. "I don't need your apologies, Mark. I don't need anything from you. Not anymore." Sarah's voice was firm, steady, and unyielding. She had reclaimed her power, and Mark was left scrambling in her wake. Mark, still reeling from the shock, tried one last plea. "Sarah, please, I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what you want. We can work this out. I can fix this. We'll go to therapy. We can—" But Sarah was unmoved. Her gaze met his, calm and calculating. "I've already started the divorce proceedings. I've got a lawyer, the papers are in motion, and you, Mark, you're going to lose everything, the house, the business, your reputation. Everything." Mark's face drained of color. "What? What are you talking about?" "I've already planned it all out. You'll pay for your lies," Sarah said, each word cutting deeper. "You won't get away with it, not this time." Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization of what was happening hit him hard. He was losing control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Sarah turned away from Mark, the last shred of her emotion now gone. She gathered her children, who had been quietly waiting in the hallway, unaware of the storm raging in the living room. "Come on, kids, we're leaving." Mark stood frozen, unable to move, to speak. The silence between them was suffocating. Sarah walked out the door, her footsteps echoing in the now empty house. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that resonated deep within Mark's chest. It was over. As Sarah stepped into the world outside, her resolve unwavering, Mark was left standing in the wreckage of his own actions. The man who had once held power over her was now powerless, left to face the consequences of his betrayal. And Sarah? She was free. Free to move forward, free to rebuild her life. She had won. The fallout from Sarah's divorce was swift and unforgiving. What Mark had once called his empire, the business he'd spent years building, began to crumble as soon as the truth about his affair spread. His name, once synonymous with success and power, was now a punchline. Gossip flew through his social circle like wildfire, and the whispers never stopped. Colleagues who had once respected him now looked at him with disdain. Friends who had toasted his success in the past now turned their backs on him, as if his betrayal had tainted them too. Mark sat in his office, the walls that had once offered him comfort now feeling suffocating. His phone rang endlessly with calls from investors, lawyers, and clients, all of them pulling away from him in droves. His wealth, his status, everything he had built, was slipping from his grasp. The very foundations of his life were shaking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His reputation, carefully crafted over decades, had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. Mark's name was now a cautionary tale. People whispered about him at dinner parties and on the street, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, the stain of his infidelity would follow him forever. His legacy, the one he had worked so tirelessly to protect, was now a symbol of dishonesty, betrayal, and weakness. The days following the divorce were a blur for Sarah. She felt as if the ground beneath her was constantly shifting, like the very world she knew was no longer solid. The pain of losing her marriage, of having her trust shattered, was overwhelming. Some days the sadness felt too heavy to carry. Yet despite the emotional turmoil, there was a part of her that refused to stay down. She had been through too much already. She had nothing left to lose. Sarah began to rebuild her life with slow, careful steps. She found a job that gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The work was simple, but it felt good to contribute, to feel like she was in control of something once again. Therapy became a crucial part of her healing process. Each session was an exercise in understanding her pain, in untangling the knots of anger, betrayal, and guilt that had tangled themselves around her heart. It wasn't easy, but Sarah learned to trust herself again, to recognize her own strength. There were still days when the weight of the divorce felt unbearable. but they were becoming fewer. She was learning to move forward, to leave the past where it belonged, and to reclaim her future. Sarah's journey toward healing wasn't one she took alone. She leaned heavily on her friends and family, finding strength in the unwavering support they offered. They reminded her that she was worthy of love, of happiness, of a life free from the shadows of her past. Her mother called her regularly, offering comforting words and an open heart, while her closest friends helped her navigate the emotional minefield of the divorce. It was in these moments, surrounded by people who truly cared for her, that Sarah began to heal. She laughed again. Real, unburdened laughter. She cried too, but those tears were no longer just about pain. They were about release, about letting go of the anger and hurt Mark had left her with. Her relationships deepened as she realized how important it was to have people who would stand by her no matter what. With their help, Sarah slowly filled the emotional void that her failed marriage had left. She discovered that love, true love, didn't come with strings attached or conditions. She was worthy of it, and the people around her reminded her of that every day. But above all, Sarah's focus was on her children. They were her reason for everything. She couldn't afford to be consumed by the darkness of her past. Her children needed her to be strong. She dedicated herself to giving them a stable, loving environment where they could thrive, despite the upheaval they had endured. Sarah knew her kids had witnessed more than any child should have, but she also knew she had the power to help them heal. She spent time with them, listening to their fears, answering their questions with honesty and compassion. Every night they had dinner together, their conversations light but meaningful, and Sarah made sure to reassure them that they were loved, that nothing would ever change that. The pain of her marriage's collapse never fully left her, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was on solid ground again. She no longer defined herself by her past mistakes or the betrayal that had shattered her life. She defined herself by the love she had for her children and the determination to give them a future they could be proud of. She worked hard to create a home where laughter echoed in the halls, where they could all feel safe and loved. Every decision she made now had them in mind. Her resolve was unbreakable. For them, she would continue to fight, to rebuild, and to forge ahead, no matter what. Sarah sat in her living room, the evening light casting long shadows on the walls. The house once filled with laughter and the bustle of a family life she had built, now felt hollow. She stared at the empty space where Mark used to sit, her mind drifting back to the moment she uncovered his betrayal. The images, the text messages, the phone call, everything crashing down on her at once. It was like a wound that never truly healed, only scabbed over, and the anger and confusion still lingered, fresh as the day she found out. How could he do this to me? To us? The questions echoed in her mind, but no answers came. The trust they'd built over years, the life they had together, it all crumbled in a moment. She felt like someone she didn't recognize, someone she didn't know how to be without him. Yet in the wreckage, something shifted. Sarah understood now how betrayal could transform a person. How in the aftermath, she could either break or be reborn. It was painful, it was devastating, but it was also a revelation. She had been shattered, but not destroyed. The pieces of her life lay before her, and while the jagged edges hurt, she could rebuild. She would rebuild. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to find her strength again, not in the way she thought, but in the way she had never anticipated. Moving forward wasn't as easy as closing a chapter, as simply turning the page. It was raw, it was messy, but it was her journey. She felt the weight of each step she took, But with each one, she grew stronger. She refused to see herself as a victim. She could have crumbled under the weight of the pain, but that wasn't who she was anymore. The heartbreak had changed her, yes, but it had also opened her eyes to the resilience she had locked away for years. She could never erase the scars, but she didn't need to. The pain had taught her how to stand on her own, how to own her story, and how to write the next chapter on her terms. "I am not broken," Sarah whispered to herself as she stood in front of the mirror one evening. Her reflection looked back at her, not with despair, but with a sense of defiance. She was no longer the woman who had been caught in Mark's web of lies. She was someone new, someone strong, someone capable. The decision to leave Mark was not just a rejection of his betrayal, it was an act of justice for herself. Every time she had to force herself to face the truth, every moment of humiliation, every tear shed in silence, it all led to this. She wasn't walking away out of weakness. She was walking away because she refused to live in the shadows of his lies any longer. Sarah had spent too long questioning herself, too long thinking she wasn't enough. But the truth was different. She was enough. Mark's actions didn't define her, and they never would again. By confronting him, by exposing his deception, she reclaimed her dignity. In doing so, she sent a powerful message. She would no longer tolerate being manipulated or silenced. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about standing up for herself, for her children, and for every person who had ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or trapped by someone else's dishonesty. "I'm done. You've taken enough from me." Her words, though quiet, were steady and resolute. With the divorce behind her, Sarah stood at the threshold of a new beginning, uncertain but resolute. The path ahead was not without challenges, but she was no longer afraid. She had reclaimed her life and, in doing so, had begun to rebuild it on her own terms. Her children were her heart, her reason for every decision she made. They were her future. Every smile they gave her, every moment of peace she could offer them reminded her why she had taken the difficult steps to break free. She knew now that by freeing herself, she was giving them the chance to grow up in an environment of love, respect, and stability. Sarah took a deep breath as she stepped outside one morning, the sunlight warming her face. She had been broken, but she was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, and she was ready to face the world again, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the woman who had overcome. She was starting over, and this time, nothing would hold her back.